Hey class, this is your Professor A. Even though I'm not doing well, I have strep, and I'm on antibiotics, I thought I would send you a video so that we don't get behind on Chapter 4. As you can see, I don't look very well. I'm at my mom's. She's taking care of me, so you might hear some chihuahuas barking in the background or my 4 kids running all over the place. Nonetheless, we are going to go through Chapter 4 so that we don't get behind. Verbal and nonverbal communication in the Confession of the Nahuas. Entitled The Mute and the Barbarian. The concern was whether or not we were able to find a solution to the language barrier, and whether there were signs, particularly nonverbal signs, that the friars could see in the penitent to see if they were truly contrite. In this case, we hear that there were external signs of an internal drama that confessors had to verify, which to me sounds quite difficult, but they were trained in this, and in some cases had to induce in the penitent, whether they were signs of tears or gestures like putting their hands up in the air. That was pretty interesting to me, to see that they had to induce in the penitent to see if they were truly sorry, truly contrite. I'm reading here from page 106. There were personal records that had undeniable proof that the penitents had truly grasped the purpose of self-examination prior to confession as taught by the friars. So as we learned in previous chapters, the friars really wanted to accept Christianity. They really weren't fighting against it, and they wanted to understand the sacraments. They were ready and willing to go to confession, but then again there's this language barrier that that they really had to take into account during this time of missionary conversion. So we see that Motolinia says, "There were so many who came to confess that I could not give them the care that I would have liked to. And I said to them, I will confess only those who have brought their sins written down or drawn in figures." This is something that they know and understand because this was their way of writing. And so we had a different way for them to go to confess. Because of the language barriers, if they can write their sins down, not just in written form, but in figures, which was something that they were used to, that was something the friars were considering taking to the confessional. The other thing that was interesting was that they could take interpreters into the confessional as long as the vow of secrecy was not broken. Writing was viewed as a simple means to facilitate the administration of the sacrament and as evidence that the penitent's self-examination indeed took place. So the writing was twofold. One, to assist with that language barrier, and two, to show that they actually had an examination of conscience. We read a little bit about St. Augustine, who declared that auricular confession and the physical presence of the penitent were absolutely necessary. For Aquinas, auricular confession of sins was obligatory, since it was not only was a virtue, but also an integral part of the sacrament. And so we're talking about being able to hear confession. We do read here that there were so many different languages that then we tried to limit it to one particular language, whether it was Mexican, and both the friars and the Indians were forced to learn that one particular language so that they could go to confession. On page 109, most informants concurred that the best way to secure the proper spiritual care of their charges was to gather them into settlements. And so now in my mind I'm envisioning that they're having to put people dependent on their intellect, which is what I got from the reading, in different settlements which would assist them with the type of evangelization that they needed to offer. Religious orders were far better equipped to implement their own programs, since from their arrival in Mexico they made the study of native languages the indispensable step in the evangelization of the indigenous peoples. And so, like I said, one of the things that the friars or religious orders were called to do. And this is why there was some contention between the priests and the religious orders, the friars that had been there initially. But one of the things they had to do was study the native languages in order to evangelize. And so they were asking that anyone that came in, if they were serious about this missionary work, they had to learn the language of the indigenous people. Page 110, in 1565, Philip II, reversing the previous policy, ordered the teaching of religion in the Indian languages, thereby recognizing the advice of the friars. And so, again, they found that it was very important that the people that wanted to hear confessions, the priests that wanted to hear confessions, understand the language of the of those going to confession, so as not to use interpreters if they didn't have to. What else do I have? The teachings of the basic tenets of the new religion and a more advanced stage in which the linguistic barrier more dramatically heightened the flaws in communication between friars and Indians, most obviously in the administration of confession. So, not only are we teaching the basic tenets of the new religion, but we're realizing that there are flaws in the administration of certain sacraments. We read this in previous chapters where we weren't sure if the indigenous people could become priests because of their intellect. And so now we're not sure if they're actually contrite in order to absolve them of their sins because of this language barrier. On page 112, we read that there were two causes that had contributed to the present situation: the frequent epidemics that made it difficult for a single priest to administer the sacraments to all those who requested them, and more troubling, the deceit of the Indians who avoided confession, excusing themselves, saying that they do not understand the Mexican language. And so, like I said, they wanted to make sure that everyone learned a new language, which was the Mexican language, so that they could go to confession. But apparently there were some deceitful Indians that said, hey, I can't go to confession because I don't know that language and I'm not grasping it. So we go back to, here I'm reading on page 113, how one might ask how the confessor came to determine when an individual is fit to confess in a language that happened to be neither the mother tongue of the confessor nor the penitent. So you have a confessor, you have the penitent, and they're learning in this new language, which is Mexican. And the question is, are they really grasping and understanding, either one of them, either party, whether or not they could absolve sins, whether or not the penitent was contrite? One of the things I found interesting is on page 114 at the very bottom, where it says, only the priest's desire and efforts to learn the Indians' languages could help overcome linguistic obstacles in an age when the missionaries could no longer expect to receive the gift of tongues. And so, understanding the gift of tongues now and understanding that they just needed to learn another language was pretty interesting, but they felt that there was this drawback to missionaries and drawback to people receiving the gift of tongues, so they really couldn't count on that or pray for that gift of the Holy Spirit to be strengthened within them, because it just wasn't happening much anymore during their missionary experiences. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them to me or any comments, because this was as with all the chapters, a very enlightening reading. One of the things I enjoyed reading was dolor. If some of you understand what dolor is, that is sorrow. It can be translated into pain. But on page 117 it says, strictly speaking, contrition should be understood as abhorrence of or a deep dislike for sin, from which dolor and sadness come and are felt in the lower appetitive power. Contrition is called dolor as a result of its effects. And so you see in a lot of writings in this chapter that there was still this understanding of what is contrition, how does one see contrition if one doesn't understand? How do the friars know that these people are contrite? They're looking for tears. They're looking at their hands up in the air. And you're going to have some attachments of some art showing what these friars depicted as sorrowful, something that's very different from today. Whereas confession was done face to face so that the friars could see emotion and body language. Now we do it privately, and that just totally changes the concept of confession to me, where the priest can't see how sorrowful we are. So can they hear how sorrowful we are? Sorrowful we are, excuse me. Or I'm just wondering the theology behind being able to see someone in their body language, since that is 80% of the conversation, and how different that is from simply hearing it in someone's voice, how sorrowful they are and how contrite they are. There was also the question of, can someone continue to go to God alone? But we need to make sure that in the church, or they needed to make sure that the sacrament in the church was present and offered. They could have just thrown their hands up in the air, these friars, and said, listen, we're not getting across. This is too difficult. We don't understand their language. We don't know if they're truly penitent. We don't know if then there's those deceitful Indians that are saying that because they don't understand Mexican, which we're forcing them to learn, they're not going to go to confession. So what do we do with them? Are their souls damned? Things as such. I keep on reading over and over again this idea of having tears. Are you sorrowful enough that you are crying when you sin? So, for example, on page 121, it says, because the sinner should have great sorrow and be tearful, if he can, for the sin that he committed, intending never to repeat it. And this condition is the most necessary and accomplishes more than all others through which we draw closer to God and give satisfaction to God. As long as we cry with the intention of confessing, we are in grace. So I wanted to ask you all, I don't always cry when I sin or when I'm in confession. I wanted to see if you all did, because apparently in this age, 16th century, there needed to be tears to show that one was contrite. What else did I want to share with you all? This is another thing that they were looking for in terms of understanding whether the penitent was truly repentant. Because when we confess sins kneeling at the feet of the priest, heads uncovered, face bowed to the ground, hands clasped and raised to heaven, and making other signs of Christian humility, although they are not necessary for the sacrament, through them we understand clearly that we should recognize in the sacrament a heavenly virtue, and that we are to seek and implore with the greatest diligence divine mercy. So again, if we think of today, can they hear in our voice that we are sorrowful? Or in just the act of going to confession, is that enough for our sins to be absolved? So I'm wondering, from the 16th century now to the 21st century, how theology has changed in terms of how we're supposed to act, or how we're supposed to sound, or if we're supposed to cry when we go to confession. There was another interesting point in this, at the end, closer to the end of the chapter. It talks about if the sick individual lost the ability to speak, but the confessor was certain that the person had acted as a good Christian throughout his life, the confessor could absolve the penitent. If there were signs, at least one sin, whether mortal or not, the confessor should grant absolution, since regardless of that person's disposition, the priest's absolution was sufficient for the remission of sins. So now we're talking about if they're close to death, if they're conscious, if they're mute. Do we need to bring in an interpreter? Will that interpreter keep things in secrecy? And there goes my phone. Let me try to fix this. I hope you all are keeping up with me, by the way. All right, I'm almost done. There were some concerns, and for example, on page 127, it says Father Diego